had the fantastic pleasure of working with him in the past. He's a super fantastic guy and a great coach. So take it away, David. Oh, one other thing that I promised I'd say: there's a ride share board now out front. If you're going to take a cab or go to the airport or whatever, there's there. And that really took away from my introduction to David. So here's David.
Good introduction. Yay. All right, let's just get a sample for who's here. Who owns one of those other than me? Okay, some people don't want to admit it. All right, I want to get an idea about, like, you guys read the thing that I wrote, but I talked to someone today who said, should I come to this session? I read what you wrote and I didn't know what it was about. So obviously I wasn't very clear, so I want to get a feel for who's here. I'm okay with, like, us taking this in a lot of different directions, but I don't want to talk past people. Does anyone here call themselves an Agile coach? Okay. Is anyone working with someone that calls themselves a coach right now? A consulting firm, someone from the outside? Okay. Who feels like they do coaching at work? Okay, that's much more what I'm interested in. I'm not here to tell you, here's the recipe for growing Agile coaches. In fact, I don't really care about that. I think if we get lost in that, we're going to have this new role that we sit around and argue whether someone is a coach or isn't a coach. More what I'm interested in is, what are some of the coaching concepts? One caveat is, well, first of all, I think I'm mouthy enough, so if you can't hear me in the back, just feel free to chuck something at the stage or just raise your hand or something. But I'm not going to tell you how to do a practice today. I'm going to show you a bunch of examples of things that I do to try and set up, sustainable Agile ecosystems where things go on beyond a consulting group or beyond an individual coach. Coaching techniques, some of which I've come up with, others of which people have taught me. Okay, so if you answered this question, first of all, does anybody know who Edward Tufte is? Have you ever seen Edward Tufte speak? Okay, shameless plug for a brilliant person. T-U-F-T-E, if you've never seen him speak before and you're interested in presentations, he's, I think, a god in that space. Tufte has a pretty serious issue with PowerPoint crushing innovation or content. So I agree with them. I'm pretty sure that, like, PowerPoint is collectively making us dumber as human beings. So I will try and keep this the right number of words for a slide, 6 to 8. I do have a couple slides that I put in here because these things are online that are some examples, because I did want to give you guys some things you could take out of this session, concrete things. But just Agile schmagile for a second. How do you guys answer this question? What does it mean? When someone says coaching, what comes to mind? Just shout out your answers. Not a rhetorical question.
Helping.
Okay, helping. What else?
Knowledge transfer.
Shaping.
Teaching.
Okay, faster than my bad hand can write. Teaching. What else?
Guiding.
Okay.
Fooling.
Pardon?
Fooling.
Fooling?
Changing a culture.
Hey, could you tell us a little bit more about fooling?
I can't.
Did I say it? I spelled it wrong? Sorry.
No, that's what I meant.
Oh, okay.
I saw a few of those.
Okay. Fooling, you mean like fraud?
Well, you can't call it fraud, but you see these, quote-unquote coaches who come to you saying they know everything, and they will tell you what to do to become happy. Well, they leave, before they even finish the first phrase,
Yeah.
They can't teach you anything.
Right,
Because
so that
they think they cannot be taught anything.
If I let him go too long, he's going to do my whole presentation. I absolutely agree. Anyone that walks in and says, this is how you should do it, that doesn't know anything about you, you should ask them to leave. Because one of the things I hear people say in the Agile space that I really like is, Agile methods are simple, that doesn't mean they're easy. I think it's good, it's a simple set of practices. That doesn't mean putting it into what Philippe called context, culture, into your world. That's where the difficulty comes in, and that's where I think coaching is potentially a new role, but a new way of thinking, a new way to try and make processes and methods sustainable. So here's what I put up, and I'm going to introduce you guys to maybe a different way to think about this stuff, just to try and kind of throw a twist at it. I think you got to do some work to get people ready, or to understand who they are, how they're delivering things right now, what their technology is, what their culture is, what their blocks are, and then you have to help people kind of find some kind of a groove. What I found is that it takes 4 to 6 iterations. Now I thought that was just my crazy idea, but I was having dinner one night with Ward Cunningham, who's someone I really respect, and I said to Ward, how long do you think it takes for a group to find their groove? And he said 4 iterations. I thought I was going to get this super fancy kind of wizard answer. He said 4. He said, you mean 4 weeks or 4 months? And he said 4 iterations. And I thought that was a really brilliant statement. That rings true for me. 4 times where people sit down and say, here's what we're going to try and get done. Let's try and get it done. What did we get done? Because it's that feedback loop, and that I think it's an interesting measure. So 4 is not a magic number. It seems to be pretty consistent with my experience. After about 4 cycles, if people aren't finding some way to improve, they're not finding any kind of ways to tune, you're probably in a little bit of trouble. Then you have to kind of keep it going over time. So this is kind of how we're going to talk about things in these 3 chunks. This is what matters to me the most, is trying to set up some kind of a community. A lot of places I go, people say team, 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 and a lot of times team equals developers. Everybody's not on the team. And a lot of the people that are saying that word aren't thinking about everyone that's in the room. They've set up kind of the team and the scrum master, or the team and the coach. And the places that I go where people are getting a lot of cool things done, agile schmagile, there's like a group of people that have bonded together and oftentimes have kind of really thrown out a lot of the ideas of, I can't do that, it's not my role. So I agree with what you said. I think there's a lot of different styles. And I just wanted to put a couple up that I hear a lot, and then I'll tell you kind of, maybe throw a different metaphor at it. So here's one way you could look at it, and this is exactly almost what he said. This is how I see it, is there are a lot of people out there coaching that walk in and they say, this is what you have to do. This is what you should do. These are the rules. This is the recipe. All these kind of, dogmatic metaphors of how you magically succeed. Now I understand, I taught music for a long time, and I know that people have to learn how to practice their instrument before they can improvise. So I do agree you need to bring in some base set of practices for people. It's important for people to say, these are the things we're doing. My style that I'm going to talk to you guys about a lot today is much more around the descriptive side of life. What are the things people are doing? What have I seen work? A lot of times, all I'm saying is, hey, you're already doing something that is now called Agile. My first company, we did a lot of things that are now called Agile, like pair programming. We just called it working together. I worked at this little shop. There was about 12 to 14 of us. It was this old church, so someone had finished it from the balcony to the front of the church, and we all sat in these dormers, and there was no cue balls. I didn't know what cue balls were the first time I went into a big company. I was like, whoa, rats in a maze. And there was an open desk policy. As we got up, if I wanted some help, I could go sit down. We also practiced test-driven. We just didn't call it test-driven. But when I sat down with him, he would say, what problem are you solving? What outcome do you expect? And what have you done so far? Same kind of notion. We have a lot of that stuff in play, and I see a lot of groups that are doing a lot of practices right now, and all you have to do is name them. So that's kind of what I mean by a descriptive piece. Another way you can look at it is like from this perspective. So this is maybe the early XP coach. They were often the super geek. Dude who could solve all problems. I think the early XP coaching was a lot more around sitting with people, coding, pairing, setting up continuous integration before that had a name. Trying to get developers to not just check in broken code was a big deal in '99. A lot of us spent a lot of time doing that, saying, hey, you know what, we shouldn't just deliver things to people that don't compile. Forget the tests. When I started coding, who's written C++ in here? Okay, so when I started coding C++, it was a social norm to lie to each other. And you would say to someone, hey, did you test that? I'd be like, oh yeah, man, I tested that. Usually meant, compile file open at best. Same thing with code review. We lied about it all the time because we were so desperately trying to get things done. The other side of this, though maybe the other spectrum, is this, the super facilitator. And the caveat for me is I don't really care about any style. I don't care about, you know, Lean or Scrum or FDD or XP or whatever. I go to like the set of practices that help people. And so I want to say that because I'm going to tell you a Scrum story. It doesn't mean I'm ripping on Scrum. I went into a group, they had about 6 teams, they had a bunch of Scrum Masters. I said to the Scrum Masters, tell me, what does it mean to be a Scrum Master? And they said, well, it means you're a facilitator. In this instance, they had facilitated extreme mediocrity. You know, the groups were just, it was all about protecting the team, we have to protect the team, and that can often turn into enablement. You know, enabling bad behaviors and not in a space saying, hey, we have to be responsible. We need to be doing kind of the right things, or as like Bob Martin says, building the right system the right way. You know, building the right product the right way, finding that balance. That's not always the case. You know, I know some Scrum Masters that have found kind of the Zen aspect of it, and they sit between these two groups. And coaches that are out there that are kind of, they have tech chops, but they also understand when it comes to running a retrospective, it's not about who the best coder is. That truly is an exercise in facilitation, and some of the super geeks just blow up in that space because they just want to talk about coding. So if we switch the metaphor a little bit, anybody read Metaphors We Live By in here? By George Lakoff? Wow, okay, there's a free non-geek book for you. This guy was a student of Noam Chomsky. This is basically his dissertation right here. No one has read this book. Oh, I'm so happy that I can give a book to everybody. What he talks about is all the things we say every day that affect our lives. I mean, coach, the way we use it, the whole Agile community is filled with these metaphors that drive us. Software development is filled with metaphors, some of which are just nasty and dangerous, like software is a building, software is a bridge. Here's one of the favorite ones we say all the time. It was like I was drinking from the fire hose. That's a brutal metaphor taken to its logical conclusion. You know? So let's think of a different metaphor, and I don't mean like what Kent was talking about. I mean these, that's why I put this book up here, the metaphors that drive us. So if we switch our metaphor just for a second to think about like coaches or producers, let's think about a different way. So here's a little weird music quiz for you guys. Anybody know who this is? Oops, I showed you this picture. Does anybody know who this is? Non-Neil Spector, close.
Phil Spector.
Phil Spector, right? This is what he used to look like. Phil Spector, skilled musician, skilled engineer, skilled songwriter, turned into kind of a crazy lunatic. But forget this part, right? And just go back to Phil Spector, the producer. The guy changed the music industry. He came up with this thing called the wall of sound. I mean, the refactoring concept of music. It's not a great parallel, but it was a brand new concept. Produced a lot of bands. Was the person who was responsible for the final production and the mixing of Let It Be by the Beatles. So it doesn't get more successful than that. So from all measures of success as far as selling records, wildly successful. Most of the people who worked with him hated him because Phil Spector was on that prescriptive side. This is how you produce music. Is anybody in here a musician? Anybody ever worked in a recording studio at all? When you go in, it's a lot like producing software. And there's a lot of similarities between the two worlds. If you think about like sheet music, that's not the song. The song is when you play it. Just like when you look at the code, that's not the application. The application is when you run it and experience it. In the recording studio, there's a massive amount of complexity. Tons of things that can go wrong. There's ways you're supposed to work. There's tools you're supposed to use. And some of the most clever people say, that's nuts, I'm going to do something different. Phil Spector had a recipe. He came up with his way to produce things. The Beatles hated this album. I don't know if any of you guys know this. Let It Be in their mind was supposed to be a way to get back to the basics. They wanted it to be kind of old school, and they later released something called Let It Be Naked because they disliked what Phil Spector did so much. So, does anybody know who this is? You're probably not trusting me because I'm showing you all sorts of black and white pictures, and I opened with an LP, so I'm not looking really high-tech right now. No one knows who this is. Okay, that might help. His name's George Martin. He was often called the fifth Beatle. There's a couple people called the fifth Beatle. Look at the difference between just George Martin's disposition. He's hanging over Paul McCartney's shoulder. He's not telling him what to do. Although George Martin, when he met the Beatles, was a better songwriter, a better engineer, and a better musician. So if you think of like, look at this guy, then look at this guy. Now, who do you want to work with? Both of them are wildly successful producers. George Martin is much more on the descriptive side. He met the Beatles. He actually thought they used to play this music called skiffle. I don't know if I've ever heard it. It's not very artful. It's a long ways from Let It Be. But George Martin met him and said, wow, what an interesting young group. They have a lot of skills. They need some guidance at first. I need to help them kind of learn how to write some songs, and eventually just step back, and the Beatles kind of took over. So a few pizzas ago and a few years ago, this is me. So this is Jonathan Cole and I were having breakfast this morning. We were talking about our shared experience working with teams, and both of us happened to say, when we started working with these Agile teams, why is it that we had some idea of what to do? We didn't read any books on coaching, but we had some context of how to make software, how to make recording projects work. And so I put this up because what I see is a lot of people have experiences that they don't draw on because they're not a software experience. So maybe your experience is with software. Maybe it's a lot of people I know that are very good at coaching or something else. Like Frank, wasn't Jutta a teacher? I think she was a teacher before she got into this world. For me, like if you think of this coaching, this is a lot of what I'm doing when I'm coaching a team. Sometimes I'm teaching someone. So this guy happened to be a fantastic musician, could play guitar and piano pretty well. This is like sitting down with someone to learn a new bit of technology, but he couldn't play a shaker track. Now you guys might think, who can't play a shaker track? But I tell you, if you go stand in front of a microphone and try and go shh, 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 for 4 minutes, you'll be amazed. You'll feel like, I can't believe I can't do this. But very few people in here could do it. It's difficult. A little bit boring. You have to kind of get into the zen of shaker land. This is the two of us pairing in the studio. Right? We didn't call it pairing. We just called it working together. But this is the two of us making the world's biggest xylophone or the world's biggest auto harp. So he's fretting the chords, and we have a very expensive microphone, and I'm running my fingers along the base of the piano to build this big, beautiful sound that we put behind the chorus. This happens all the time in the studio. No one, this is not how you're supposed to play piano. This is not part of anybody taught piano lessons. They probably never taught you this. But it's a beautiful sound, right? And it happens because there are rules. There's rules in here. There's coarse technology. This is a $5,000–7,000 microphone with a gold diaphragm that if you mess it up, it's broken and it's gone forever. Very delicate, but we're using it in kind of an innovative way. And just lots of different things. This is a tough job. You're sitting on one side of the glass. You're trying to communicate with what the advertising world calls the talent. It's not, it's a euphemism. It's not a beautiful expression. Or I would say the musicians. I'm trying to figure out what to do. If you've ever stood out in the studio, it's super scary. It's a little bit of like when a newbie walks into a software project and they don't know anything about the project, and you have to try and set up an environment. That's what this whole thing is about. That's what I feel like I do when I'm coaching, it's like producing, is to trying to set up environments where when I leave, there's a comfort level. It's not a foreign notion, the space, the place. So I could go on and on, but I wanted to give you a different kind of context. So if we think about this pre-production, for me this includes a lot of things. Hydrating backlogs, setting up collaborative workspaces, things like iteration 0, and a bunch of other techniques that I use. Primarily the two I'm going to talk about are ways that I try to understand who I'm going to coach before I start coaching. Because that's kind of exactly what he was saying, is you just can't walk in and start telling people what to do if you don't know anything about their world. The first one is this. So it says assessment and incentives. Assessment's a nasty word, kind of sounds like something the Inquisition would have done. So I don't really know what to call it. A better name for this would probably be interviews. And I'm not going to go through all these things, but I want to tell you one story that I do a lot of times. So these guys were a group that asked me to come in and coach them. I would sit down with them at a table and say, so tell me how you guys build software. And then there might be a lull like that. And in shops that don't have a propensity towards self-organizing, these guys would panic for a minute, then they would look over at the man and say, what's he going to say? What is the boss going to say? A lot of shops I go in and do that, and everybody starts talking. And it's one of the first times they've ever collectively talked about how they work. They have processes, but it's more tribal knowledge. You ask that question of a little functioning Agile team, they would say, well, we queue up work, we prioritize it, we kind of estimate it, break it down, and we meet every day. At the end of this cycle, we get together to say what we've accomplished and what we haven't so we can improve. And that's an interesting aspect. it was really interesting listening to Philippe's keynote today, because I'm trying to do a lot of the same things. I'm trying to get what he was calling context. I would say, how do they work right now? How many places do they want to try Agile development? Why do they want to try it? You know, are they trying to improve, or is it like, well, everything else hasn't worked, so let's try this? So I did a little bit of work with a Google group in Santa Monica, and in this, we did our first assessment on the phone, like a half hour. The manager that was talking to me, that was potentially going to hire me for that gig, asked me 4 times, how is this going to be helpful for our people? Because he wasn't worried about being agile. He just wanted to be more of what he already was, which I think is kind of turns Agile into another set of tools you can use, instead of kind of a ceremony unto itself. Here's an example of one of these. So I kind of only took chunks out of it, and these assessments aren't monstrous things. Sometimes they're 30 minutes, sometimes they're half a day. The biggest one I've ever done was 2 days. It's not trying to come up with the exact information. It's for me as a coach to try and understand an organization before we start changing things. And by the way, it's not just a consulting kind of gig. So I do a lot of work with my coaching of trying to grow groups of internal coaching, or coaches in organizations. This is one of the things I teach them, is don't assume because you have success on project A that you can walk over to project B and put them in the same process box. That's what's wrong with methodologies. Every little project community has its own kind of subculture, its own context that's meaningful. Their co-location, their technology stack, their language, the domain they're in, who they deliver to. So I'm trying to kind of understand what people do well, why they want to change. You know, do they want to change in a bunch of places? Do they want to make a bunch of changes? What's going to work for them or against them? One of the people I know in the Agile community that I really respect says he won't work with a group that won't set up a collaborative workspace, because he knows that that proximity feeds, it reduces waste and it feeds delivery. I don't feel that way, because I work in a lot of places where that's not a reality, and I don't want to just slam the door on people. But I get why he does it, because I agree, every time we put people together, we tend to get more done, we have less waste, we have faster discussions, it's easier to have the discussions we need to. This is all about trying to understand people, because, who's seen this before? Anybody seen this before? Virginia Satir's change curve? This is a pretty interesting picture to look at. I'm not going to walk you all the way through it, but something happens, change isn't for free. If you want to improve how you're doing, she said, a lot of times there's going to be some noise. This could be people being concerned. This could be people trying to kind of learn a set of practices. I very much like the notion of like, I'm more agile than you. Who cares? Here's a smell for me. When people spend more time talking about how agile they are, as opposed to what they deliver, they're probably trying to change too many things all at once. It's more interesting to me to have people saying, yeah, well, look, we're getting this done, we have this problem. Oh, I bet we could use this agile practice to solve that. Now it's another tool. It's a set of tools, and I think change works when it happens with people instead of to them. So I do that assessment, and then I publish back some kind of little coaching plan. I'm working with a company in the Twin Cities right now called Reuters Thompson West Publishing. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of it. It's like the biggest legal software, one of the biggest legal software companies in the States. And so we're starting to grow a collection of internal coaches. And this is what they do when they're trying to spread the use of agile methods inside the organization. They go in, they put together this little transition plan. So, you know, how long of a time frame do we want to try adding these changes? Which things do we want to change? Where are we going to change them, and how do we know it's valuable? This is a weird kind of like test-driven everything notion that I use in my coaching that's super helpful. Did I understand their culture? Do I think they can change as fast as they can think they can change? A lot of times I'll hear the people, those of us that are passionate about agile stuff, saying, well, they just don't get it. That's what we say when we're frustrated, or it's too slow. There's some kind of a transference of values. They're not going as fast as we think they should. This is a nice way to understand, do you have a level of respectful change? Are you changing enough things? And I put up an example because for me, I'm always looking to try and change a collection of 3 things, but not a million practices. So something that drives discussion, social fabric, something that's about the product and the progress of delivering that, and something about the mechanism to do that, or social fabric, product planning, and iterative delivery. If I get a critical mass of a set of practices around those three things, then I can usually start the discussions I need to. We can have real discussions about what we're delivering and what our mechanisms are for doing that. So one of the other practices, I said something that I've been a fan of building, like innovative communities. This is a practice I use a lot. So is anybody in here a manager? And who's in, okay, so for any of you, have you ever written a project charter? Okay, what was in your project charter?
High-level description of what we're gonna try and deliver.
Yep.
What the team was, what resources we're gonna dedicate to delivering that, rough time frame for what we wanna deliver.
And possibly risks or things like that?
Key stakeholders,
Yeah.
timeline, budget, high-level business objectives to duration.
Okay, it's the whole enchilada.
Right.
It's the whole thing. So who's read a project charter in here? That's the problem, right? We have these things, they express all the things we talk about all the time, but they're shared by two people, the person that wrote it and the person that signs off on it. So the difference is that we're doing with this, and it's not a magic, there's nothing up here if you could read every word that you would say, oh my God, I'm stealing that sentence. I mean, a lot of the value that happens in this charting session is not up here. It's a forum for starting a discussion, and for me, it's one of the strongest community builders I've found. And it's broken into some simple sections, you know, elevator statement, goals and success measures, a couple different ways to map communities. What do we value? What do we think is going to stop us? Maybe some logistics around what cadence are we going to put in place? Are we going to use 2-week iterations, 4-week iterations, no iterations? What kind of processes make sense? And this is a really interesting chunk I just want to focus on right here. It's easy to have a kickoff session where you have PowerPoint and you have, you know, caffeine and you have donuts and you get everyone hyped up on caffeine and sugar and you send them out of the room and it's like, let's go get it done. And some of the people walk out of the room and say, we're never going to get that done. Start this large project, you have people that are already sure it's going to fail before you start it. Maybe because they never had any voice. Again, it's not a magic document, but if you want to see collaboration, it's right here. This is a group of people saying, these are the goals for the project. Well, how do we know when we've met those? It introduces that idea of test-driven or value-driven or whatever you want to call it right at the beginning. And I've done these chartering sessions where there was 2 business units sponsoring a development effort. One development team. They had very common goals, but very different ideas of what done meant. And we stopped the project before it started. In an hour chartering session with a cross-functional group, we stopped a dysfunctional project before it started. So what did that cost us? $10,000 at most. With all the people in the room, would probably save the company $2 million. Should have charged them more. You know, I mean, I think that's success. You don't, because you can. I sat down early on, and I was super excited about index cards and user stories, moving away from requirements documents that nobody read to having discussions with people. But it's also easy to sit down and just start writing a bunch of cards and assume you're going to deliver the right thing. If you want to read an interesting blog about this, Jeff Patton has a really neat blog about an early XP project where they had all the XP practices going on and they delivered nothing of value iteratively. So they kind of didn't know where they're going. A close-up of one of the practices is this crazy, weird, hippie thing that I do called community mapping. It came from, I was working with a group, and we were having discussions about who does what. And it was kind of the company where your role defines you, as opposed to what you do is a tool. So we sat down and said, these are the people that are building the system, developers, database, ops, designers. These are the people that are tracking the system, big bosses, managers, whatever. I don't not necessarily care about those buckets. These are the people that are kind of saying, here's what it is. Product people, product owners, customers, insert your favorite metaphor, business analysts. And everybody comes up and draws their name where they live in relationship to other people. So the discussion is about what do we do, not what's my role. Because there's just these weird big circles. And it's again, it's not a magic picture, but there's a lot of valuable discussion that comes out of it. Like when someone erases their name and moves it, or if you do one of these things and you end up with a chart that looks like this, where all the people are kind of out on the fringe here, and you have a couple people like in this space, I mean, those are the people that are the de facto coaching people. They're the ones that are holding the social fabric of the project together. They're probably often project managers who are wildly stressed and close to quitting. If you have a charting that looks like this, it can be good, right? You'd think you'd want it to look like this. It's like, look at all of us collaborate, right? That can be good. That could be a group that's all about saying, you know, we all kind of are trying to blur roles, or it can be a situation where everyone wants to drive the bus and no decisions get made. You have 20 hands on the wheel and it's really hard to kind of go anywhere. There's all sorts of cool things. This is pretty classic. On this project, under the builder section, there's Dude 2 and Dude 3 who are going to magically show up at the beginning of the project. They don't know anything about the domain, but they know the technology, and they're going to start delivering on day one. You know, knowing how to write Java does not help you deliver products. You have to understand the domain. These guys didn't invite the testing group to the charting session. You know, big smell right there. This is an example where the testing group is not part of the team. All it took was this picture and about 15 minutes to expose that. That's the notion of, like, that's why I think this is such a nice tool. And after we do the immediate community, I mean, I could go on and talk about this for a very long time, because for the investment in this, half hour tops, as a coach or someone that's going to try and help people change, I learned an enormous amount that I haven't figured out other ways to learn. I guess I won't tell one more story. This company had a real investment in the rational unified process. They kept telling me, well, we're never going to be able to do Agile. We can't do Agile. They're not going to let us do Agile. There's this group. They're not going to let us do Agile. I was like, wait a minute. Okay, first of all, who are they? Do they have names? No, are they like software demons that float around and shut down projects? Well, no. You know, it's Jay and Kathy and Steve, and it turns out it's people from architecture and management, requirements, and testing. And they're formed because there's so much chaos in the company that they want to get feedback about projects to see if they're just kind of blowing smoke when they say we're 80% done. We told these guys, you know what? Come to our planning sessions. Feel free to come to our stand-ups, and definitely come to our reviews so we can show you our metrics, and we're going to talk about what we're producing and what we're not producing. And they loved us because we had the information. I mean, we delivered stuff because we figured out how to tune and get along, but we were one of the only groups at the company, and this is a big mortgage company, that was actually doing the process we said we would. So there's a lot more things in that pre-production space, but I wanted to put up a couple of them to give you context to say they're all tools. For me, we're tools if you want to grow coaching to try and get to know people, how they work, what their incentives are for adopting Agile methods, how they're getting along, how they view, you know, who does what work. The tech leads often sit between these two worlds. Some of the best coaches I've met were tech leads that say to me, well, I don't really do any real work anymore. And if you go and look at what they do, they're the people that are kind of connecting communities. They're that social fabric piece. They're trying to kind of get translations in place. So some early practices. Again, this is not how, right? So I put fostering responsibility. I could have put a lot of things up here. This is a real kind of a classic space of people working collectively. They got task wall up. They're kind of all sitting together. They have an interesting model in place. So over here is the work they're doing, and over here is the quality of the work they're doing. So in their space, this is quantity, and this is quality right here. Every day, when these guys are in their stand-up, this is the work they're trying to get done. 2 states, not done, done. If you can't grok that, metric, you probably aren't qualified to be involved in software. Not to be harsh, but it is truly binary. Over here they have, what are the issues? So every day they kind of have this fader that goes between quantity and quality, and they're forced to look at it all the time. That's a technique, an easy technique. It doesn't really take anything other than setting up the environment if that's possible. Beyond that, there's some really cool, this slide could have been called, test-driven everything culture. Because they have some really cool things. This little thing that you guys can't read here was something that came out of the notion of all of us saying, we want to foster tests in everything we do. So this thing says, if you can't test it, you can't task it. It was a cultural statement they all made to say, if we don't know when it's done, how could we possibly figure out what work we need to do? It doesn't say, if the testers don't write tests, we can't work on it. Right? It's a statement to everyone to say, we all have to take ownership of it. This is these guys, there's probably some other people in here doing this. and they're capturing their requirements in a wiki. So everything they do that's a detailed discussion is a test. So just shameless plug for the Solutions IQ guys. We were talking about story testing IQ, which is a wiki version of Selenium. It's another tool. We're using Fit here, but it could be the same thing. It's a way to, this is their analyst, right? So this is a bad ratio of analysts to geeks. You know, that's usually death for the analyst dude. And he's kind of a proxy to the business. But the business, the real product owners nearby, they're able to do that because the onus is on everyone to say we're going to define done as a collection of tests, and it's not his responsibility. It's not the testing group's responsibility. The testing group tends to write better tests than everybody else. But the notion is, if we don't know what it is, let's not start on it. Here's another funny tool. Has anybody heard of the Midori Technique? If you're at the Agile conference, you might have. You have? Yes. Are you Italian? No. Okay, good. This is a classic timer, kitchen timer in Italy. They're shaped like these tomatoes. So if you ask an Agilist, especially the Roman Agilists, how big is that story, they would say, I don't know, it's 4 tomatoes. So, well, what's a tomato, right? It's really an interesting model. It's, you work for 30 minutes, 25 minutes where you code, and 5 minutes where you get up and walk away. Because they're trying to set up a culture of staying fresh. I think, in truth, for some of them, it's the time to go smoke. But that's it. So, I taught a class there after the XP conference 2 years ago with Rick Mugridge, one of the guys that had made a significant contribution to fitness. And they asked us to teach the class in Midori. So it was 25 minutes, 5 minutes off. 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off. And I thought that was going to be a really clunky way to teach. And now it's the technique I use every time I'm teaching. And they're very hardcore. When the tomato goes off, you get up and they set it for 5 minutes and you walk out of the room. And Rick went past the limit of the tomato at one time. He talked 26 minutes, and one of the Italian professors came up and said, you need to respect the Pomodori. I use this like when I'm doing training for classes. We do 50 on and 10 off, so it's a really neat way. We'll do it when we're trying to kind of, I'm sure a lot of people in here that are working might use a similar technique. A lot of times when you're estimating, if people are stuck, set some kind of a little timer. One of the groups I worked with had this huge sand timer that was kind of ominous and was silent, but it was sitting there and sands are flowing down through. And when they were doing their horse grain estimation, like for release planning, they said, you know, 5 minutes per story. At the end of the 5 minutes, we're not going to say, oh, time to move on. But we're going to say, if we talk for another 5 minutes, is our information going to get twice as good? That's kind of not about how long it takes to estimate. It's about time boxing things. And that's where I think you get into the value of doing it over the dogmatic, this is how we do it, practice piece. This is a good picture for me because this is a group that doesn't have a lab. There was no way to set up a lab for them. But, so this is a cork board, it's in a hallway, it's about the worst environment, the farthest away from the ideal, like, collaborative workspace or, you know, lab setting, team room. Because it's in a hallway, so in the middle of our stand-up, people just walk right through the stand-up. It's an uncozy vibe, it's not great, but it was the very first thing these guys ever had that was a visible plan that they could start gathering around. And what's really neat here, the thing that I'm looking for as a coach is like annotations that the project community does, because that's usually an indication that they're bonding. These guys had an onshore-offshore testing solution. They were pretty revved about what are we going to send to the offshore testing group if we're doing a lot of our work in a narrative format, you know, balancing the written versus the spoken. So it's hard to see here, but they have some really classic, simple story cards, and underneath them, they have cut up their test plan that goes across the ocean to India, so that they have an open discussion about here's what we're doing, here's when it's done. So that's kind of a balance of a certain level of documentation, or like what Philippe was saying today, distributed development is not free. There are some constraints around it, just like there's constraints when you're, one end of the spectrum is Ruby on Rails, at the other end of the spectrum is SAP. You know, glacial movement, daily movement. I guess glaciers move every day, it's just not very much. Pretty easy wall to read. These guys have a tool, they're using a spreadsheet, if you can call that a tool. And so they have kind of this daily discussion starter, and then they have their little metrics up there. And one of the things I want to kind of talk about a little bit is the stand-up. So who's been in a stand-up meeting here? And who uses the 3 questions? And who thinks they work? Okay, mix of hands. And I'm not saying they don't, but I go into a lot of shops where the 3 questions have turned into, yesterday I went downtown to look for a job. You know? So you teach a job album. There's no, you know, in a galaxy before the 3 questions, we just showed up at the stand up and talked. The value of the 3 questions is what? Exposing duplicate effort, trying to understand, kind of share discoveries, and making connections and talking about what's blocking you. So an easy way, something you can do as a coach, for instance, is to say, let's throw out the 3 questions if they're boring and replace them with, what did I discover yesterday? Who do I want to connect with, and what's stopping us from getting work done? And it's just a little variation, but something about getting the discussion going on. So it's not just erping things up. You know, here's the 3 things we say every day.
Part of the reason that we use 3 usual questions is it keeps things focused, because you find that if you open it up too much, your 15-minute meeting suddenly becomes a 45-minute discussion.
Or worse, everybody hear the question we said, it focuses the discussion. So I'm not down on the 3 questions. I'm down on a practice that becomes more ceremony than essence. You know, so what happened on some of the early stand-up meetings on the XP projects is people would just say pass. You know, their whole life was sucked. Things were bad. Their ID didn't work. They weren't delivering things. They were like, you know, cool, pass. So I like that aspect of it. It's just some way to kind of keep it fresh. I mean, this might sound really simple, but I know as a coach, if 2 people are having a hard time, I try to stand near one of those people or walk in with one of those people and maybe covertly get them to stand next to someone else. Or it's amazing to me how many people stand in the same spot during the stand-up meeting every day. You know, so I might just disruptively stand in between 2 people across different days. One of my friends practices what he calls tea-driven development. So he's British. So every day he shows up and makes tea for someone, delivers it to their desk and hangs out and gives them tea and shares tea with them. And it's a cool little ceremony that's trying to do the same thing, start discussion. So that's, my rant is not the 3 questions are bad. My rant is if they're mundane and you're not having discussions anymore, you need to change things. Because that's one of the things that leads to atrophy in practices. It's like, yeah, we stopped doing that because it was boring. Because of the way they were doing it was boring. Has anybody ever taken music lessons? Okay, who enjoyed it? Okay, yay! Okay, at least some people. What I found when I was teaching guitar was when you teach adults, they don't want to practice scales. You have to help people kind of do things they're interested in. I think the practices can't, some of them are going to be hard, right? Practicing isn't necessarily fun, but if you make it something that's valuable, people are going to A, get more out of it, and B, more likely to do it. This is another weird idea. So this is a group right here. About 8 developers, half of them are Java geeks, the other half are .NET geeks. The Java geeks went to .NET boot camp, and they all got thrown into a .NET project. I mean, these guys were wildly successful, but in their first sprint, there was an enormous amount of discussion. And so I don't know what you guys would call this list, but I would say a very large chunk of this is architecture. This is a group of people trying to talk about how do you have consistency in the code and the design and the presentation. It's got to be some definition of architecture in there. It's consistency. And there's everything up here from how they work, like everybody's supposed to update, rebuild all, run the tests before they commit, to issues like enums, to not using a default, all the way down to pretty is pretty important. And so the way this list got filled up in the first sprint was started by me. I was sitting down pairing with people, and some developer would just be saying, well, I don't like how he's doing enums, blah, 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 blah. And it's a way to kind of say, yeah, part of me wants to say, yeah, dude, that's the biggest problem we have. Oh my God, if we don't solve enums. It's like those nasty C++ arguments about where the braces should go, and blood was let over that discussion. This is a way to kind of get those things up here. So what these guys did is I just started posting them, and then they started writing them up. And then we started having what I think like the XP practice of collective code ownership. That was the value behind it. Try to get everybody sharing information and working in a similar manner. This is a vehicle for starting that discussion. These guys are also a .NET project, and they're using ReSharper. So for the geeks in the room, does anybody write .NET code in here? A lot of times what I see in .NET projects is people navigate the classes through a hierarchy. Here's the structures. Navigate down to the structures every time. And if you have a stupid name for a class, you just click down through the folders till you get to the dumb name for the class and double click and open it. These guys said, we're not going to do that because we value the idea of refactoring. We want to keep the code communicative. So they said, everybody needs to learn at least 2 hotkeys every sprint. And one of those was to use the class browser to search for classes, because then if the name is dumb, you have to type a dumb name every time you go to open the class. And that's a good motivator for saying, that's a stupid name, we should change it, right? One of the groups I coached, first week you paired with people, they flipped the mouse over. They were like a bunch of IntelliJ geeks, and I thought it was a little bit hardcore, but it was really interesting because you quickly learned like the 10 hotkeys that everybody used so they could stay focused on the problem. It's not the Emacs model of like the person that knows the most magic key combinations is a wizard. So, what things can we do to stay focused on delivery? And that's what I think the message is here. So one more of this. What would you guys call what you see? What's happening here?
Hustle?
What's that?
Hustle?
I still didn't hear it, I'm sorry.
Hustle.
Yep. Yep. What else? What else would other people call it?
Swarming.
What's that?
Swarming.
Yep. Okay, I'll give you a hint. This is the customer, this is the developer, and this is the tester. Maybe it's not super self-evident. Who's using user stories in here? Who sits with someone and watches the customer or the product owner, the business person, go through the acceptance test before you say it's done? Okay, so not a lot of people. That was a pretty core practice we did early on that's been dropped in a lot of Agile camps. And we used to have, before continuous integration, old school dude I am, a machine in the corner, and that was your continuous integration box, and you walked over there and you updated it and you rebuilt all and you went through the tests, and then you called up the business person to come sit down with you, and you sat with them while they went through the acceptance test. And it's pretty easy to do usability testing. If they're clutching the mouse with a death grip, it's not a usable system. This is interesting to me. This has, I coach kind of all over the place, all over the States and Europe and Asia, and this has, the name for this 3-person group has popped up in tons of places, so maybe that's a meaningful pattern. One group I coached called this the Troika. Another group calls this third done testing. Another group calls it done, done, done. Another group calls it DUT testing, developer, user experience, and testing. They're all 3 groups, 4 groups that don't know each other have come to the same conclusion that says, if we get these 3 people involved and looking at something before we say it's done, we have a better understanding of cost and quality, and we have can really better say that it's done. So it's a simple, doesn't have a fancy name other than maybe people call it story sign-off, but it's something that's interesting to me as Agile grows and becomes more enterprise-wide, that this gets dropped a lot of times. And it's really, all sorts of fascinating things happen. To just digress for a second, I think I'm doing okay with time. I was doing a session like this the other day, and this company had hired this really fancy design firm to come in and make their e-commerce store look real special and stuff. So the design firm did a really great job. It was really cool. They had all these dynamic menus. It was really fancy, pretty classic stuff. When you hover over them, you get the list that pop down, and they put the search box right here. And so the woman that was doing the sign-off, the search worked perfectly. She sat down, clicked here, her mouse floated up over here, and the dynamic menu dropped down and covered her search box. She did it 3 times, and this is like programming we've done to people with software. She did it 3 times, and the third time she said, "Oh, I'm so stupid." No, she's not stupid. The computer is stupid. The design is stupid. You know, she's just a human who clicks on something, lets go of the mouse, and it just happens to float. So she doesn't have to enter a bug report. She doesn't have to justify it. She doesn't have some developer saying, "Oh, it works on my machine." You know, that's kind of gone. Who's a tester in the room? Anyone? I don't know if you guys have this, but I've seen this now. We'll talk about a pattern. I've seen like multiple times where I went in the testing lab, if there's a testing lab where the developers don't tread, and inside the door it says, "It works on my machine." I'm so sick of hearing that. It's like this joke behind the developer's back. That's kind of gone in this space. The other thing that happened is we were doing that sign-off, and she did something that was a caching bug, and she didn't know what happened. The guy that I was kind of coaching, and it happened, we looked at each other like, "Dude, did you see that?" And we asked her to do it again, she reproduced it. We were just diligently trying to write down what she did. Ran downstairs, couldn't reproduce it, went back up, she reproduced it just like that, and we fixed it. She wouldn't even known that was a problem. She didn't kind of know what was going on, but we discovered it because we were there with her. It takes couple minutes to do this. Small investment, huge return. So, in my final few minutes here, because I'm trying to stay on track, some tuning metrics. Some of which, I'm guessing some of these things you guys might already be doing, maybe some of them are new. Who in here is doing retrospectives? Okay, and honestly, I'm not picking on any of these practices. I want to really get some kind of real information. Who's getting value out of them? Okay, that's interesting that it's that low. I think it's, you know, if I have to go into outer space and I get two Agile practices, this is going to be one of them. Because this is that piece that Ward was talking about. This is where you find and kind of do your tuning. But I sat with the product owner the other day. It was in a group where there was this nasty division. The product owner kind of wasn't part of the community. He wasn't on the team. They had taken kind of some roles, new roles that they were given, and they had just dropped people into role buckets. And they weren't kind of acting as a group, like a whole team. And they said, yeah, I don't really go to those anymore because nothing happens. Because in his situation, they talked about what works, what doesn't. They come up with some things that are going to change, and then no one does anything about it. You know, and that's the hard part, is you have to do something. You don't have to be super extroverted, whiz-bang dude to make change, though. Sometimes the change can happen just in the form of accounting. So in this group, you can see one of the things that wasn't working for them that they wanted to change was their scrums went too long. So they said, we want to make sure that our scrums are wildly informational. And they have a dude on this project who's kind of like the Stephen Wright of software. His name is Bob. Bob always pretty much talks like this, doesn't get really excited about life ever, even if he's on fire. And I said, Bob, you should sign up to be the one that makes the Scrum wildly informational. And the rest of the team looked at me like, do it, Bob. So Bob was not going to make things wildly informational, but what works is when the Scrum turns into kind of just another meeting that a lot of people, no one wants to go to just another meeting. Bob says, today, I don't think the Scrum is wildly informational. You know? Then there's a chuckle, and we're all like, that's right, man. This isn't supposed to be just another dumb meeting. This is supposed to be a place where we share information and make connections. So in that case, he's more of just an accountant. But there has to be some accountability. And this is a huge list. This is way too much for most groups. And if you start your next retrospective saying, what did we change? And your list was 10 and you only did 2 things, then you should only try and change 2 things. That's that respectful change notion. Find a couple things that help you improve. That's where I do think the coaching piece, like the producing piece, is what are the things you want to help people change? Because I used to produce albums where I was a much better player, a guitar player, than one of the other guitar players, but I couldn't just play that person's part for them. I probably could have, but it would have been pretty rude, very Phil Spector-like. You know, move, take this, and there are producers that do that. And there's producers like Daniel Lanois, the guy that produced U2, and Peter Gabriel, who's a fantastic guitar player who would never step in and play someone's guitar for them because he'd use that as an absolute insult to those individuals. And if you're pairing with people and all you do is code and tell them how cool it is, they don't learn anything, because the difference between pairing and watching someone code, the latter is just called watch programming. Watch it. It's not the value of pairing, having a discussion, sharing information. This is more of a, this is a big project. So this is a group that has 5 to 6 teams of 8 to 10, pretty large project. They're doing a retrospective, a little bit more ceremony over time. So they're doing this model where you put up a timeline. In this case, it's across 4 or 5 months. And talk about significant events. Someone quit, someone merged, changed technology, did a big delivery, things like that. And then up here, people take a little bit of time and write things that worked well. It's like the same format as the last one. Things that worked really great go up here in green. Then they write things that maybe didn't work as well. Things that are really horrible go down here in pink. The value of this is figuring out over time what you do well so you can do more of it. Not just focusing on the negative aspects. So here, they worked a bunch of overtime. You know, taboo on Agile projects. Not a good deal, it happens. So what happened when they were working overtime is a lot of people wrote post-its about working overtime. It turns out that sucks. People don't like doing that. But at the same time, the vast majority of the post-its that they clumped together that were similar said that during that time period, they bonded more as a community. So if you can figure out how to make this happen, what happened in here, then you have things you can put over here on your action item. And if you want to say, how do we lead a large program of multiple subcultures or sub-teams or whatever word, now you have a tool to discover that. And that's really what this retrospective was focused on. All those people came together at their period. How can we do that again in a proactive fashion, or a fashion where it doesn't happen when they're in a war room? This is another one. So who are the developers? Who in here codes? Forget whether you're a developer or not. Okay. Why do people not refactor? Number one reason is
Because there is no user story for that, for refactoring. It's just
Okay.
something kind of people do on their own time.
no story for it. What are, maybe it's another reason people don't refactor, even simpler.
Not enough unit tests.
Not enough time. Not enough unit tests is a good one, yeah, because that's a dangerous model. When the business hears refactoring, where someone says, I broke that during the last refactoring, like, whoops, and I still hear that from people because they didn't have enough tests. It's the time issue, or an awareness. This is a weird little tool. This is from working with Dow Jones building the virtual stock exchange. And this is a way for the developers to say, we want to find a balance that we're trying to do a level of habitual refactoring, but we're not doing big giant refactorings that take us offline and then stop us from delivering. Just without saying it, who feels like they could give a working definition of what refactoring is? Show of hands, come on, there's gotta be a couple of people in here. Okay, so that's interesting. It's probably not unrealistic. I sat in a session the other day, and after an hour, this tester leaned over to me and she said, what's refactoring? Because the developers have been saying this word for an hour, and she didn't know what it meant. And that's not because she's dumb. That's because it's kind of part of their subculture. And one of the problems with refactoring is people don't make a value statement about it. Refactoring and test-driven become this cult of personality that people are fearful of. Oh, it's not happening as much as it should. This is a way to kind of call that out. Let's make it visible. Let's start having discussions. Maybe someone comes into the lab and sees this and they say, what's that? Bang, now you have a tool for talking about the value of refactoring as opposed to it's another agile practice because it's refactoring in context. These are some things that we think we need to do to keep the code base healthy. These are some things that we've noticed that we haven't been doing consistently over time because we've been overly focused on delivering things. And I don't say that in a glib manner like just ignore delivering things, right? Because there's groups that take delivery offline in the name of refactoring. And one of the techniques I use a lot of times is a refactoring threshold. If you want to make it habitual, make a space for people to do it. Say if you're estimating with points, your average story is 10 points, you say let people do any refactoring that's under 2 points. Then you've made a space for people to be able to do it. And anything that's over that, maybe we should talk about it. Maybe the developer should talk about it. Maybe we should raise the visibility of it because it turns out it's not a little refactoring. It's a behavior that we want to change because we're not doing it habitually, and that's why we built up that depth. This is another one. This is a group that is saying, this is metrics you get for free if you have continuous integration. They're saying, during their first sprint, how many times did they build, or how many failed builds did they have, and how long did it take to fix them? An easy measure of responsibility. Why is the build going unbroken for a long time? And I mean, they're doing a lot of builds. They're doing like hundreds of builds in some cases. It's just a really simple measure. Is anybody familiar with this? This looks like maybe a good thing to monitor on a project. Well, the cool thing is, one of, I think, the best coaching things you can use is humor. So there's a new tool now, if you take the first letter of each one of those, it's called crap for J. So you run this against your code, it looks at like complexity and coverage, and that gives you a crap map, a crap factor. How crappy is your code? Which method is the most crappy? It's a good way to laugh at yourself, And I didn't believe in a lot of the psychomatic complexity until I ran this against some code bases. This is a good way to start saying, man, things aren't as good as we think. So this, you can call this like a metrics mashup. It takes more than code coverage because you can have a lot of coverage for a lot of crappy code. And that's good, right? Especially if you want to start doing some refactoring. It doesn't mean your code's not crappy. We're not really complex because complexity quells agility. This is another thing you can do. Does anybody's hand out? Has anybody ever done this? Like at the end of a iteration, just take a little polling about happiness or satisfaction? What's in yours, Chris? What kind of questions do you have?
We would actually do kind of the, are you happy this sprint, or were you having problems, and what did you feel like? We might even write words on a card and go around and talk about it.
Yeah, I've seen people put up the little faces like at the doctor.
Yeah.
Everyone puts a sticker by them. One guy had mood of the day on his whiteboard. These aren't statistically brilliant, but if people don't feel proud of their work, they're not going to innovate. Promise you that. Right? This is a pretty, if you said, do you want to continue using Agile methods? Everybody says no. Why is that? You know, is it because everybody's being told what to do and you're not kind of talking about the things they're already doing already? This is just a set of questions that one client did. I didn't write these. And it's just a sample. If you just do ones and zeros, yes or no, and you have a score that's average of 0, you know you have some problems. You know, it's just a simple way, once you have a cadence in place, to start doing some sampling. Just a couple more and I'll be done because I know I'm out of time here. This is an interesting group for me as a coach. Some developer put this up. So this is the sanity meter. And on this side you have relatively sane, and on this side you have losing my grip on reality and spelling, as someone pointed out. Things are grim in their world because the guy has deprecated all these, which in coding language means they don't exist anymore. So he only has this state, mostly insane and totally insane. I mean, that's someone that's pretty much saying, I'm not happy. Right? Talk about radiating information. This is the opposite. This group said, you know what, we want to start posting some of our core values. And they had a crappy space, no lab, only one pairing station right behind the door, and you had to be careful that it didn't slam into you when someone walked into the room. And one of the things they put up here is gumption. That's one of their values, which is from, Chris and I were talking about Zen there and motorcycle maintenance. That's one of the words that Robert Prizik uses in that book to talk about going forward. So that's an interesting model for me. This is the last slide I have. This is, I think, one of the most important things coaches can do. Is anytime someone calls me the expert, I just kind of cringe. Anybody in here read Freakonomics other than me? If you read Freakonomics, you never want someone to call you the expert again, because they talk about how the expert realtors help us buy homes. You know, and it's not a term that's used in a helpful manner. It's just that I don't really even care too much about that syntactic argument, but I don't think you are the expert. One of the people that can help you know the most is the newbie. When the newbie walks into the project, if you're doing a bunch of dumb stuff, they will tell you if you let them. If you just watch them, when people start saying crazy tribal lingo, the newbie will kind of go. You know, it's like a dog when they look at something they don't understand. Those people will tell you some of the most information. Or if the metrics aren't meaningful but they're agile, then throw them away. You know, you have to have things that work. But I think I'm out of time, so I'll stop. If you guys want to ping me, this is my propaganda. If you go to my website, prepare to be wildly underwhelmed. I spend most of my time working, so my site is mostly neglected. But I'd be willing to take questions, or you can feel free to send me an email. Shameless plug to suck up to the Canadians in the room. I will say that I was the one that lobbied for the Agile conference being in Toronto this year, the big Agile conference, because over the years I've seen like the Canadian community do a lot of things to promote agility. So I said that at the end, so you know I wasn't sucking up.